Thanks, Sherry. And thank you all for coming today or for staying. Mr. Gray's talk was going to be part of a series that we're calling Becoming Alabama. And some of you may know about this already, but for those of you who don't, let me tell you just a little bit about this. What we wanted to do was at least something that was in sympathy with what he was going to do. What he was going to do was to talk about what was going on in Alabama 50 years ago from now, as the civil rights movement was kind of in this pause after the Freedom Riders had come through, and what was going on in communities around the state during late 1861, looking into early 1961, looking at early 1962. And that program is part of a larger set of programs. For those of you not aware of this, during these next 4 years, Alabama is observing 3 really huge sets of anniversaries, major events in our history. It's the 200th anniversary of the Creek War, the 150th anniversary of the Civil War and Emancipation, and the 50th anniversary of major events in Alabama that were of national importance in shaping the civil rights movement and shaping a national history. And it's such an ironic coincidence that these anniversaries are all coming at the same time. For us as history agencies in Alabama, and this is not just the archives, but a number of historical organizations across the state, we didn't have the money to do 3 different sets of commemoration with all the financial problems that we're facing, not only here, but I mean other agencies and other organizations across the state. And also, these 3 events are kind of intriguingly linked. So instead of trying to do 3 separate commemorations, what we decided to do was to try to look at them all together as part of a larger process of shaping who we are today. The archives preserves records and artifacts that really tell at least the part of the lives of millions of people who've lived here before us. For some people, we have really substantial holdings that tell a lot about their lives, and for others, just scattered documents here and there, scattered references. But all of their stories together tell a story that is incomprehensibly rich and multifaceted and complex. Those of us who work with these records and these artifacts every day, and also who work with the scholars who are trying to study them and make sense of them, do not have any pretense ourselves of that we understand the whole. Every day we learn more of how little we know about how huge and complex the story is. So I hope you will take what I'm trying to say today not as some kind of official statement of history, which it is definitely not, but as a personal appreciation of a few of the great dramatic stories of 3 epic events in our history, not only of our state, but of our nation. So with that as a kind of a background, let's go on to the story. Again, the 3 big events and their dates. And what I'm going to do is talk a little bit about each one and then make some concluding marks at the end. First, the Creek War, probably the least known, but of these events, but it is a rich and an incredibly fascinating story. Look at the early 1800s, there were probably 20,000 mostly Creek Indians in the land that is now Alabama. Really, we talk about the Choctaws, Chickasaws, and Cherokees, but this was more their hunting land. They would have little portions of Alabama as part of their hunting land. The real people who lived here were mostly Creeks. By the early 1800s, they were mostly kind of in the Chattahoochee Valley and the Coosa, Tallapoosa, Lower Alabama Valley is where most of them lived. And this was a beginning of a really difficult time for the Creeks. During the 1700s, they had prospered with the deerskin trade, selling deerskin to the Europeans, and that brought them a really pretty good bit of money. Deerskinned buckskins were really popular in Europe during the 1700s. And the Creeks could also play the Spanish and the French and the English off against each other to kind of preserve their independence. So during the 1700s, the Creek Nation actually prospered. By the early 1800s, things were changing dramatically for them. The Americans were pretty much in control and were pushing in on their land. The Spanish were still down here in Florida, but they were weak, and the French and English were pretty well gone. The Americans were not nearly as conscientious about respecting Creek rights as the British and the French had tried to be. And in fact, the Americans kept encroaching and pushing onto the land. And also the deerskin trade had fallen apart. The new textile revolution that was taking place in Great Britain replaced deerskin with textiles. And so the Creeks were in this terrible situation. The source of money that they had depended on was drying up, and they no longer had the diplomatic leverage to protect their independence. The American government had consciously adopted a strategy of trying to teach the Creeks how to farm, raise animals, conduct their domestic life the way the Americans did, to Americanize the Creeks. And Benjamin Hawkins was down as the Creek agent trying to show them how to become like better Americans. Some Creeks were doing that, and some Creeks were fairly successful in doing that. But by 1810 and 1811, there was an increasing resistance that was building up in the Creek world. Creeks who were saying that our traditional way of life is being jeopardized. We have to preserve it. We have to protect it. We have to get rid of these American trinkets and the junk that's corrupting us and that's poisoning our lives. We have to throw these people out and protect our land and our lives. These Creeks were increasingly called the Red Sticks. And by 1810 and 1811, they were forming a distinct and strong community within the Creek world. Some of you may have heard Catherine Braun's talk here in August about Tecumseh coming down and speaking at the Tocobachi Oak, where it was supposed to be this great turning point and this gathering of Indians who were ready and increasingly resistant of American pressures. Well, by 1811 and 1812, these two factions of the Creek world were starting to actually fight among themselves. By 1812 and 1813, there were actual times where one group of Creeks was raiding and attacking the village of another, and there was a kind of a civil war that was breaking out in the Creek world based on this resistance. Whether to cooperate with Americans or whether to resist, and the Americans were continuing to encroach, bringing more and more pressure on the Creeks. This internal friction in the Creek world happens at the very same time that the United States is beginning to fight Great Britain in the War of 1812. And as we are fighting Great Britain, the American settlement down here in the Tensas and then up in the Tennessee Valley, one of the things that the American settlers who are here are terribly fearful of is that British agents operating out of Spanish Florida will cause these Indians to rise up and attack the settlers on the frontier. They had actually done some of this during the American Revolution, and the memory was not that far away. In fact, there were groups from Alabama that were Indians who were raiding Georgia during the American Revolution, and these settlers were afraid that the British would use the War of 1812 to create an alliance with the Indians and start attacking the settlers in the backcountry. So as tensions built all through 1813, the things became more and more difficult until finally, in July of 1813, a trading party of Creeks that had been down to Pensacola and was going back, and they had picked up some weapons and some powder and shot from the traders down in Pensacola. They were carrying them back, and they were attacked in July of 1863 by a group of Mississippi Territory militia at Burnt Corn Creek. So here you've got, for the first time, a Creek trading party with not a war party, but a trading party, and they may have been carrying weapons, but they were a trading party, attacked by an American militia group. The Red Sticks were outraged at this attack, and they responded the next month with a brutal and vicious attack on the Americans on the frontier thought that the violence was breaking out, so they gathered at these little forts. And a group of Americans, about 400 or so, gathered at Fort Mims. This is a kind of a late 1800s depiction of what was called the Massacre at Fort Mims. But about 900 Red Sticks gather and attack this settlement down at Fort Mims in what's now Baldwin County. And they kill 300 or 400 of the people who are gathered inside the fort. Some of these are mixed blood Creeks who are allied with the Americans who've been fighting the Red Sticks. Some of these are African American slaves, and they're people who have mixed blood of all three races who are gathered inside this fort. And then some of the Red Sticks who are attacking them are also of mixed blood. William Weatherford, Red Eagle, the leader of the Red Sticks, had more white blood than Indian blood. So there's this incredible kind of a mixture and a churning on frontier life. But what was called the Massacre at Fort Mims, and it was a brutal slaughter of hundreds of people, the word spread like wildfire all across the South. And units were formed, militia units with some regular soldiers were formed in Georgia, in the Mississippi Territory over near Natchez, and from Tennessee. And these three columns converge on Alabama to attacking the Red Sticks. The Tennessee column, of course, is led by Andrew Jackson, and they attack out of Tennessee with both regular troops and Tennessee militia. There is the fighting is brutal as Fort Mims was. There is this is a little bit on the gruesome side, but it's such a dramatic illustration of this. Any of you ever read The Life of Davy Crockett? Davy Crockett was in Andrew Jackson's troops, and you can read this yourself. It's in Google Books. Just look for The Life of Davy Crockett. But he tells this episode that takes place up in what's now Calhoun County at Tallahatchie. And in the incident there, he talks about they attack a bunch of Creeks. They all flee and gather into a house. And his other militia units are approaching this house. There's an old squaw sitting on the porch, and he describes this in detail. I've got a copy of his narrative here. It says, she takes the bow and puts it between her legs, puts the arrow in, pulls the bow back, lifts her legs, and points it at these Americans who are coming. She shoots it, and it kills a lieutenant whose name was Moore. And Crockett says it's the only, this is his own words, this was the first man I ever saw killed with a bow and arrow. He said, in response, we shot them like dogs, and then we set the house on fire, and we burned it up with 46 warriors in it. I recollect seeing a boy who was shot down near the house. His arm and thigh were broken. He was so near the burning house that the grease was stewing out of him. In this situation, he was trying to crawl along, but not a murmur escaped him, though he was only about 12 years old. So sullen is the Indian that when his dander is up, he'd sooner die than make a noise or ask for quarter. And these stories are incredibly rich, incredibly powerful, incredibly dramatic. This is the depiction in the biography of Sam Dale of the famous canoe fight. About 7 months of very brutal frontier warfare ends at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend in March of 1814, and this is actually a a map, a plan of the battlefield, one of the documents we have in our collection. You can see where the Indian barricade was and where Johnson's troops, the barricade, and where Andrew Jackson's troops were. In March, Jackson's troops, along with a number of Indian allies who were hostile to the Red Sticks, attack the Red Sticks and kill hundreds of them, probably 800 people, including some women and children, were killed in this terrible battle at Horseshoe Bend. But with the battle at Horseshoe Bend, the Red Sticks were totally devastated. Their crops were destroyed, their food supplies, their villages. They were living in the woods, starving to death. Minowa was the famous Minowa was the battle leader of the Red Sticks at Horseshoe Bend, and he miraculously escaped with, I think it's 7 wounds, and lived on as a great leader of the Creeks in the years afterwards. This is a depiction of the surrender of William Weatherford, Red Eagle, to Andrew Jackson. And the treaty that comes out of this, there's a treaty that's signed up at Fort Jackson, Fort Toulouse Jackson, up just south of Wetumpka. A treaty is signed there in August of 1814, in which not only the Red Stick Creeks, actually the Red Sticks Creeks were hardly present at this treaty conference. They had already been defeated. Most of the Creek signees here were the friendly Creeks who had fought as Jackson's allies, but they were forced to cede much of their land in Alabama. And you can see on this map the reserve that was left to them after the treaty at Fort Jackson, the little land between Georgia and Alabama was all that's left. And one of the really interesting things you can see in this treaty too is how Jackson did this strip along the south that the Indians were forced to cede, so that there would be a barrier that would be created between the Spanish and British agents operating out of Florida to isolate and contain the Creeks. You can see consciously how Jackson was doing this not just against the Indians, but this was a war strategy as part of the war against Great Britain. Another thing that I didn't even know until I was up at Fort Toulouse a couple of weeks ago for Frontier Days, but this is kind of obvious when you see it, but the fort that Jackson built up at Fort Toulouse, and you can go see the remnants of that fort today, is not an Indian fort. This was a fort like they would build along the coast that was designed to defend against a British assault with cannons and a full army assault. And they were fearful enough of a British invasion coming up the fort. So even here in the interior part of Alabama, they built the same kind of fort that they would build along the coast to defend the state. So the Creek War then ends with the opening up of Alabama for settlement. Just as, again, this industrial revolution that had already made the deerskin obsolete was expanding in Europe and demanded increasing amounts of cotton to supply the textile engines of England and of New England. And the increased demand for cotton and the relatively high market and the availability of all this wonderful, rich new land led to this dramatic arrival of tens of thousands of new settlers in what historians call, or what many of them called, Alabama fever. As people rushed in this new land grab to grab land and to start growing cotton for this international market and to get themselves rich. And within just a few years after the treaty at Fort Jackson, we had enough people to create the state of Alabama. This is the first page of our first Constitution, which actually is stored just a floor below us. We the people of the Alabama Territory. And it's one of the things that's really interesting in reading the Constitution itself. There is one of the first parts of the Constitution is, after the preamble, is the Declaration of Rights. And in section 1, the very first section of the Declaration of Rights, it starts with, we declare that all freemen, when they form a social compact, are equal in rights. Now, think about this. Just 43 years after the Declaration of Independence, where we said, we declare that all men are created equal, we have altered the words to make sure that we can accommodate the institution of slavery. And carefully altered words from the Declaration of Independence. And of course, opening up this new land and the extension of cotton farming gave new life to slavery, created a great new economic engine that made slavery newly profitable, and it led to the expansion of a new kind of a harsher and more aggressive kind of slavery across the state, from the Atlantic coast all across these new states of the South, and with Alabama as leading the way. And it was the end of this period then, the period of the Cotton State period that ended with the Civil War, that is the next set of commemorations that we observe. By 1860, Alabama was one of the richest parts of the United States. The wealth of cotton accumulated over the course of 40 years had made a lot of people really wealthy, and the per capita wealth, at least white per capita wealth, was enormously high in many parts of Alabama. With 40 years of this enjoyment of this growing prosperity and the kind of way of life that it made possible, Alabamians were becoming more and more defensive and protective, white Alabamians were, of their institutions. This flag is the flag of the Young Men's Secession Association of Mobile. It was a group that was created before the Civil War to advocate secession and to train militarily to defend secession. And the units from Mobile that were mobilized initially to seize the federal installations around Mobile at Mount Vernon and Fort Morgan, this flag was carried in the seizure of those facilities, actually before Alabama had even seceded from the Union. And just a few days before the Union, Governor Moore declared that was in order to ensure and protect the peace and security. But on January the 11th, 1861, Alabama, the Alabama Secession Convention formally adopted this Ordinance of Secession, which is also stored below us here, declaring Alabama as having seceded from the Union, as being a separate and independent state. And the preamble to the Ordinance of Secession in this text, let me just show you the text for that, is really an interesting document. Whereas the election of Abraham Lincoln and Hannibal Hamlin by a sectional party avowedly hostile to the domestic institutions and to the peace and security of the people of the state of Alabama is a political wrong so insulting and menacing a character as to justify the people of the state of Alabama in the adoption of prompt and decided measures for their future peace and security. Again, you get the sense here of the feeling that had developed through the 1850s as the more and more voters in the North were determined to prevent the expansion of slavery into the western states, and how sentiment built in Alabama, feeling that denial of the right to carry slaves into the western states was not only an insult to our honor as a member of the Union, but was a threat to the rights of at least white Alabamians. In the Ordinance of Secession, one of the sections there also invites representatives from other seceding states to send members, delegates to Montgomery, to discuss steps that would be necessary to promote our common security. So in February, the month after this ordinance was adopted, delegates from other seceded states arrived in Montgomery and established the Confederate States of America. Again, images from Jefferson Davis's inaugural parade and the inauguration of Davis that took place 150 years ago last February. The story of the Civil War in Alabama is a rich and fascinating story, and it's not one that's not very well or often told. When we read about the Civil War, we tend to read about the battles in Virginia and Gettysburg and Vicksburg and even the naval exploits of the CSS Alabama. But the story of what actually happened inside the state is an important and fascinating one, at least for people who live in Alabama. By early 1862, federal gunboats, federal gunboats had already come up the Tennessee River, and they seized Florence, and they moved all the way up to the Tennessee River, eventually seizing Huntsville. So starting the early part of 1862, less than a year after the war started, significant portions of North Alabama were already in Union hands. What happened around that was a whole set of one of the things that happened was a whole set of guerrilla warfare tactics by Confederate sympathizers who lived in the area and who were trying to fight these federal forces. We didn't have regular troops, that many regular troops to defend the area and try to drive the Union forces out. So a kind of a guerrilla warfare developed that was particularly harsh and brutal again. There's a historian who's been doing a lifetime's work on Lawrence County, and he wrote a really interesting section of his work about what was going on in Lawrence County during the Civil War. And he said there were some parts of Lawrence County that changed hands 17 times through the course of this war. And each time one new group would come in, they would exact revenge for what they regarded as atrocities of the previous group. So this series of reprisals just built in viciousness and intensity, so that by the end of the war, much of North Alabama was laid waste. There were people who were starving to death. Their crops were destroyed, their farms were destroyed. They were literally starving to death, to a point where when the Freedmen's Bureau came in at the end of the war to start providing food and support for the freedmen, they actually fed more starving white people than they did African Americans, former slaves, because the war had wrought such devastation in North Alabama. It's really a fascinating story of North Alabama. Meanwhile, South Alabama remains as a place of production to supply the rest of the Confederacy. You get things like the salt works down in Clark and Washington County. The Selma becomes one of the arsenals of the Confederacy. More than 10,000 workers, steel workers, iron workers, were working in Selma during the Civil War, producing ordnance and weapons and materials for Southern troops. And also we were trying to grow food supplies. We were a hospital. All of these things were really interesting. By late 1864, things start falling apart even for the lower part of Alabama. There's Rousseau's raid that comes in to cut the railroads between Montgomery and Atlanta, attacking around Opelika and destroying miles and miles of railroad track. In August, Admiral Farragut attacks the Confederate, attacks Mobile and Mobile Bay and the fort at Fort Morgan at the mouth of the bay. And by the end of the war, Alabama is left in just ravages. It's really interesting. Those of you who, before it closed down, Jack Warner's museum over at Tuscaloosa had both of these two wonderful paintings. This one by William Fry that shows this kind of the aftermath of the war, with one brother who is a Union soldier taking care of his wounded brother who is a Confederate. And this one by Constant Meyer with a Confederate soldier taking care of his brother, who is a wounded and mortally wounded federal soldier, and this depicting this bloodbath between brothers, the ravages. This was the bridge, the railroad bridge across the Tennessee River at Decatur after the war was over. The details don't show up this very well, but this is a wonderful map we have that was done in July of 1865, where somebody went in and put these notations about the destruction for each one of the sections of railroad in Alabama, how bad the destruction was, and how to get from one place to another with the railroads not working. This is Fort Morgan, after Farragut's bombardment and the destruction of Fort Morgan. But for all of the damage and destruction and death that the war brought, it did end the institution of slavery. This photograph shows one of the Reconstruction legislatures after the war. In the summer of 1867, federal voter registrars came to Alabama, started registering blacks, men, for the first time to be able to vote. And though they were never a majority, you can see here that there were black members in the Alabama legislature. And they participated all the way into the 1870s. Some of you may have heard Mills Thornton's talk here earlier this year about the Reconstruction period, and I don't have time here to try to summarize it, but Mills said something that if you think about those 10 years of Reconstruction, probably all of the bad possibilities that could come out of it, probably the worst one was the one that came out of it. It was a horrible 10-year period of struggle for power that left a record of hardship, ill will, and a new government afterwards that was determined after the 1874 elections to restore and reestablish and secure white control of the institutions of government, and gradually to remove blacks from any meaningful participation in Alabama government. And in the years after that, the institution of segregation gradually settled in and hardened in the early part of the 20th century, which leads up to the third set of anniversaries that we're commemorating. The civil rights, three big events of the civil rights movement in Alabama. Again, Mills did this talk too. The first talk in May was on the 50th anniversary of the civil rights movement in Alabama. And I think two big things to note about the Freedom Riders here for those of you who were not there. The first is that the Montgomery bus boycott was an important event. It brought Martin Luther King to the fore, focused on his doctrine of nonviolence, but the outcome was really just the desegregation of the Montgomery, Alabama bus system. There was not a kind of a larger legal order. At the end of the Freedom Rider rides, the bus was in Anniston. This is the Birmingham bus station where the Ku Klux Klanners are given 15 minutes or so by Bull Connor to attack the Freedom Riders when they arrive. And this is Jim Zwerg here in a Montgomery hospital after so many of the Freedom Riders were beaten on the streets, on Court Street, trying to get off the bus and trying to escape the attackers. But as two great points come out of this. The first is that the Kennedy administration, that had been kind of on the fence about civil rights. I mean, Kennedy wasn't elected president of the United States in 1960 based on a campaign for civil rights. It was not a priority of his administration. Many of the events of what took place here in Alabama forced him and drew his administration into a stronger defense of the civil rights of African Americans. They could not let this kind of brutality they could not ignore it. They had to start taking action. In fact, some of the members of the Kennedy administration were among the people who were beaten at the bus station here in Montgomery. So it drew the Freedom Rider movement, drew the Kennedy administration into participation in the civil rights movement, and I think against their will, reluctantly. And the other effect was that by September, I think it was, the Interstate Commerce Commission issued national regulations systematically desegregating interstate commerce, interstate transportation, bus stations, restrooms, not just in Montgomery, but all across the United States. So for the first time, you get a federal agency actively taking a role nationwide in desegregating public facilities. So two huge consequences of national importance from these events that took place in Alabama in May of 1861. And there were plenty of other events that were nationally important, but the next really big one was, of course, the Birmingham demonstrations in the spring of 1963. The fire hoses and the police dogs and the fact that this new national media, the evening news, with television was covering these things. I really think, and then in September you get the 16th Street church bombing, and all of these events, month after month, piled on top of each other, I think had the effect of convincing most people in the United States, and even some white Southerners, of the moral bankruptcy of segregation. And it prompted Congress. It really helped induce Congress to pass this major civil rights legislation the next year in 1964. It helped create a background for that. And then the third great set of events in Alabama, again, that were nationally important, were the Selma to Montgomery March and the voting rights movement. We just got a fascinating set of new slides. There was an Episcopal minister who died in Texas, and in his estate was a bunch of photographs that he had taken during the Selma Montgomery March, and he just stayed with his material, and we were able to get the material. This photograph is from his collection. But at the end of this march, partly because of the death of Jimmy Lee Jackson and the demonstrations in Selma and the commitment of Lyndon Johnson, Congress passes the Voting Rights Act, which has this profound change of enforcing the rights of African Americans to be able to vote for the first time all across the South, in every county, in every city. Systematically, federal law enforcement come in to protect and ensure the rights of African Americans to vote. And the structure, the legal structure of the system of segregation finally falls apart. It doesn't mean that everything is resolved or cured by any means, but that at least the legal underpinnings of segregation and even the political structure that helps support it are no longer standing by the end of this. So I think these three great anniversaries, excuse me, Al. I think these three great anniversaries and the fact that they occur together just give us a whole new way to look at and think about Alabama history. And I would like to conclude with just a few observations, and I was trying to think about some way to offer something profound, and I keep coming back to platitudes. But I think maybe what thinking about these together helps us see is to see again things that we already know to be true. One is that history doesn't always bring progress. I mean, in America, we tend to think that we're always getting better and always building a better society. But that doesn't always happen. If you look back in history, you see plenty of places where we've taken wrong turns, and there have been terrible consequences because of that. And I think we can't take progress for granted, which kind of leads to the second point is, democracies are fragile and they require civic nurture. I mean, in Alabama, we've seen times when the democratic process has broken down and we've seen the awful consequences of that. I think, again, this is a reminder of the responsibility all of us have as citizens to be aware, to be involved, to be thoughtful participants, and to nurture and protect the institutions of democracy and law that hold us together as a people. And I guess finally that all of us in Alabama carry scars of past conflicts in us. We come from families, we come from sets of experiences that have memories, habits of mind, ways of thinking, kind of a knee-jerk reactions that grow out of our own experiences and what we've taught and learned, what we've been taught, what we've learned from our families. Often these are unsympathetic to similar situations of other people who have different backgrounds and different histories. And maybe in thinking about these events and how they've shaped our lives, we can be more conscious of the incredible variety of experiences and the burdens that others share and be a little bit more sympathetic to their views. I think there is one great thing that has come out of all these struggles. In our 1901 Constitution, We the People of Alabama was written by a group of white men. And I think one of the things that as a result of these three great events today is that the meaning of We the People is more inclusive. And I think that's something that we can celebrate. It's made us a far better state than we were. And I think it's something that we can honor and celebrate as we think about these commemorations. Thank you very much.
We will now take questions. If you have a question for Dr. Bridges, please raise your hand and let us give you the microphone. Speak into the microphone, please. Thank you.
I don't have a question, Dr. Bridges, but that's the most remarkable address I think I have ever heard in the state of Alabama.
Thank you, Dot.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm honored. Thank you.
Yes, enjoyed your talk, Dr. Bridges.
Thank you.
That picture you showed of the legislature just post-Civil War.
Yes.
With the I counted about 4 evidently freed slaves among the representatives. Of course, it's just a fantasy. It didn't happen that way, but do you think things might have been different if just a few people had been a little more charitable in allowing the freed slaves to have meaningful representation in the place where they lived? Could it have been somewhat different if they'd actually been a little more charitable and actually allowed them to represent themselves?
Well, I'm sure that's true, but I mean, asking people to be charitable in really difficult circumstances when they are struggling for their lives and their own perception of their world is around them. You know, it may be more than we could expect of human nature. Again, I think Mills's talk about how it just seemed like everything that could go wrong did go wrong. It was just an incredible and brutal, difficult time, and you know, again, it's worth. It has such drama and such power in that 10-year period. It's worth a lifetime of study just to get in and try to understand how all of those pieces worked against each other, and how they kind of worked against the good of society. Even things like a national depression that hits in the early 1870s, and as they were struggling to rebuild the economy, the whole national world collapses, and the banks are in jeopardy, the railroads go into bankruptcy, municipalities go into bankruptcy, the state teeters on the verge of bankruptcy. You know, everything is going bad. Cotton prices are falling. You know, the federal government provides no meaningful leadership. There's these inconsistent and ratcheting federal policies going back and forth, and then these enormous and bitter internal divisions in Alabama, not just black versus white, but different sections of both communities who don't agree with each other about which course to follow. It is an amazing time from our history.
Yes, sir.
Yes.
Robert Cope. I'd like to concur with my friend Dr. Moore in the commendation of the excellence of your remarks.
Thank you.
And I have found this to be one of the best presentations I've heard here, if not the best I've heard here. And you were commenting on the history, not exactly, but the frailty of democracy that history has shown. And I think that we are seeing that frailty today.
We've got a lot of challenges today, and our democracy is challenged for sure. Yes, ma'am.
Good afternoon. My question is rather simple. The Becoming Alabama, the photography.
Yes.
Could you put that back up because I recognize two of the photos.
Let's see.
And
The-
they're the Native American.
That's Menawa, who's
How do you spell that?
MENAWA. Up at up at Horseshoe Bend, I think they pronounce it Menawa. And he's very remarkable man. He's the guy who survived the battle at Horseshoe Bend with all the wounds, and then later became a leader of the Creek National Council trying to protect and preserve Creek land.
But from a photographer's standpoint, was the clothing more colonial instead of
Yeah. Yeah, well, actually, if you go upstairs and you look at the paintings, the lithographs we have in the hallway of the Indian leaders, you can see this detail, the detailed drawing, painting of him, and it's a very, very fine work. So you can see the one that this was based on there. It's in the hallway upstairs.
And who designed this?
The Department of Travel and Tourism had a person who actually does she actually do coins for the she does coins for the Treasury Department, and she did this. They were going to be making some medallions that they were going to offer as tourism promotions, but I don't think they've gotten around to doing it yet. But we've used this as the logo to to show all of our Becoming Alabama programs.
Who's the general in the middle?
That's Joe Wheeler.
Oh.
On the far side of the room.
Good morning, Dr. Bridges.
Yes, sir.
Good afternoon. I have no question, but I'd like to make a statement that all of us here, as a result of hearing this great presentation, should lose our fear of one another, so that instead of having a few minorities and a majority of the rest of us, that we should communicate with each other so that we will come together. I hope you hear what I mean. We may be integrated, but we are not together. We're not a community as we are hoping for, which would take away some of all this stuff we are going through now as a community. I hope you understand what I'm saying. Okay, thank you.
Here.
Going back to the agreement of 1814, where the land area was set aside for the creeks. While working with the state, I come to find out there are several little small pots of land throughout that area that some of the Creek Indians still control. What happened to that disintegration of the area that was set aside, and how those little pots hold on?
I don't know all the details of that, David. I know that the treaty did include some kind of, there was the big area that was carved out here and preserved in 1814, and then there were later treaties that were related to the creek removal. And in the process of those treaties, there were specific land areas that were carved out and were given to individual creeks. Some of those creeks, I think, particularly some who were of mixed ancestry, were able to protect and keep their land. Most of the Indians were done out of their land in one way or another sometimes by fraud, sometimes by force, and so that most of them were removed. But even like the Porch Creeks, for instance, were able to get federal status as a recognized tribe because they could document this kind of continued history from the period after 1814 up to the present. And it was very difficult. It's very difficult for Indians to do that because in the 1800s, starting with the late time and after the removal, many of the Indians or those people with Indian blood tried to cover up their Indian ancestry because they were fearful that they might lose their land. So there was this period where records don't show that very much, and so it's difficult. Many people who have some Indian blood in them might have difficulty proving all of that unless they can do specific genealogy, but often that's kind of covered up in official records. Does that answer your question? Yeah.
Question here.
Yes.
If I can speak past this front. In the geographical maps early in the presentation of Becoming Alabama, there was a map that showed the territory of Mississippi, which butted up to both Georgia as well as the Gulf. And then later we see the panhandle of Florida coming across and Alabama appearing to run starting with the river in the north. Perhaps it has in there someplace the answer, and you covered it, why we're cut off from the coastline. I think it had to do, if I caught it right, with the Americans trying to defend against the French, the Spanish, the English, as well as the Creeks during that time, and setting up buffer zones. Is that where the source is, or where?
Are you talking about the current current Alabama-Florida boundary?
Yes.
Yeah. It's a really long and fascinating story. It really goes back to colonial claims. But at the end of the American Revolution, the British concluded one treaty with Spain and another treaty with the Americans. And neither treaty specifically, the treaties didn't coincide on what the border was, the boundary between the southern U.S. and the Spanish colony of Florida. So the Spanish, after 1783, claimed up to a line that would run across where we are today, all the way down. The Americans claimed the 31st parallel was the boundary. And that was decided in a 1795 treaty, the Treaty of San Lorenzo, in which the Spanish agreed to the 31st parallel. And so that's what really establishes the border. And then the reason that the Perdido River is on the Alabama side instead of that's the boundary between Alabama and Florida goes to the fact that the way I understand it, it dates back from the American claim that when we bought Louisiana and the Louisiana Purchase, we bought the old French territory. And so we actually, during the War of 1812, we seized Mobile when it was still occupied by the Spanish, and we claimed then all of the property over eastward to the Perdido River. The Spanish still control all of Florida west of the Perdido up until the Treaty of 1819. So, I mean, that story of the coast during this period is just a fascinating story. Then you have, Andrew Jackson running down there and invading Spanish territory, chasing the Seminoles, and it's a fascinating story.
We'll take one more question on the front row.
Dr. Bridges, how are you sharing Becoming Alabama beyond the walls of archives and history, and what do you hope will come out of Alabamians learning more about becoming Alabama?
Yeah. Well, we started doing this as the world was falling apart on the economy, so what we haven't been able to do nearly as much as we had hoped, but there are things where a lot of activities are still going on. Now, some of you may get Alabama Heritage Magazine, and every quarter they're doing this little section about what was going on 200 years ago, what was going on 150 years ago, what was going on 50 years ago, so that you can read it each quarter and get a sense of what life was like, what was going on in in that same quarter of the year earlier, and to see events unfolding, not knowing their outcome, but to see how people at that time saw them. So we're trying to do programs here every year that focus on these themes, and there are other. Auburn is doing a symposium in January, I think, on becoming Alabama and the immigration issue, right, Steve?
That's right.
Do you remember
We've got some cards out in the lobby with the dates and information on the website on that.
This is the Center for Arts and Humanities at Pebble Hill. So there are a lot of organizations that are doing programs here and there as they have the resources to try to build on these themes of becoming Alabama. Thank you very much for coming today. Even though Mr. Gray couldn't be here, I really appreciate you coming. Thank you.